This is a reading of Gwen Semel's You Share Good, uncopyrighted and published into the public domain by the author. Introduction. A while back, I went to speak at a high school. I talked about my art, my process, and even a bit about how I make my living as an artist. As I was leaving, the teacher handed me a card that read simply, You Share Good. This is one of the nicest things that anyone has ever said about me, and the teacher's kindness left me vibrating blissfully for the rest of the day. But when I finally got over myself, I realized that something profoundly important was buried in that statement. You share good could also be, you share good. It's about being good at sharing, but it's also about goodness as something that can be shared, something that is limitless and can't be stopped once it gets started. Sharing good is something we all do with our best selves. It's why life is worth living. Hi, I'm Gwen. I'm a visual artist, mostly a painter, and I've made my living from my art for over a decade. For much of my career, I have refused to claim the copyright on my work, and this book is about why I made that decision and why you might want to as well. Before we dive in, I want to address a regular concern that crops up when anyone besides an intellectual property lawyer talks about copyright. The fact is, even though I don't have a Juris Doctorate, I know plenty about this stuff. In some ways, I might even know more than most lawyers because, like all artists, I have skin in the game. I don't get to sit in an office and ponder how all this plays out for creatives. I live it every day. Both my creative process and the results of that very intimate and often difficult process are being regulated by these laws, so I care quite a lot about understanding them as fully as possible. While I acknowledge that intellectual property law is complicated, so complicated that even unspecialized lawyers have trouble navigating it, I'm not going to let that scare me away from the topic. I refuse to stay ignorant or silent on the matter of copyright just because I didn't go to law school. What's more, I don't believe that any artist should remain ignorant or silent about copyright law, or any part of IP law for that matter. There's just too much at stake. That's why I wrote this book. Also, please note that throughout this text, I'll mostly use examples from my own work, meaning that copyright and its alternatives will be viewed through the lens of visual art. I do think that the concepts and even the practical tips that I talk about are relevant to all forms of expression, but I'm running the book from my area of expertise. If you're a writer, designer, performer, or musician, and you want to talk about how the ideas in this book apply to your world, please send me a note. I'd love to chat. The book is organized in roughly 3 parts. In the first few chapters, I concentrate on copyright both as a law and as a way of viewing creativity. I dig into the conceptual stuff quite a bit with the aim of providing a fresh perspective on imitation and originality. Next, starting with a chapter called Getting Business Done, my focus shifts to more concrete matters. I talk about how copyright and its alternatives actually function, as well as about how our values play into how we might choose to interact with the copyright system. In the last chapter, I share practical tips for artists who are just beginning to question copyright, as well as ones who are ready to free their work completely. But before we can get to all of that, it's vital that we establish some definitions. As you'll see, I've translated these from lawyer speak into regular speak in order to make the explanations as straightforward as possible. In doing so, I've tried very hard to avoid skewing the meanings towards my preferences, but if you're worried about my bias, I encourage you to look up these definitions elsewhere as well. The terms in this brief glossary are arranged in order that makes the most sense conceptually. Copyright. The exclusive legal right to use artistic material and to authorize others to do so as well. The uses can include printing, distributing, or performing the artistic material, but can also involve the creation of a derivative work. The copyright is automatically assigned to the originator of the material, but it can be sold and owned by anybody. In the text of U.S. law, there exists a restriction on the copyright holder's absolute control of their artistic material in the form of the fair use limitation. Intellectual property. A work that is the result of creativity, such as a painting or a design, to which the originator has rights and for which the originator may apply for a registered copyright, trademark, patent, or other form of legal protection. Intellectual property is often referred to by the abbreviation IP. Derivative work. Artistic material that is based on one or more pre-existing artworks. Common types of this sort of work include translations, cinematic adaptations, musical arrangements, and art reproductions, but also mashups, since a derivative work is defined in Section 101 of Title 17 of the United States Code as any artistic material created by transforming one or more pre-existing artworks. Fair use limitation. This restriction on the copyright holder's absolute control of artistic material allows for some uses of the material without first securing permission from the copyright holder. When the material is used for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research, it is not an infringement of copyright. I talk more about the fair use limitation as well as about the limitations of this limitation in the practical tips chapter. Public domain. The state of belonging to or being available to the public as a whole. This term can be used in reference to public land, water, or some other resource, but it can also be used to describe certain cultural expressions. When artistic material is in the public domain, that means the work is not subject to copyright. It is available for use by anybody. Free culture movement. This social movement promotes the freedom to distribute and modify artistic material without seeking permission of the originator. While the movement objects to overly restrictive copyright laws, which hinder creativity, this does not mean that those who are part of the movement expect artists to work for free. Quite the opposite, people who believe in free culture are forging new business models, ways of working that reflect more fully our deeply social and share-tastic nature as human beings. And with that, we can begin our exploration of what it means to be free, both in how we make our art and in how we share it. Chapter 1. How to know if you believe in copyright or not. A lot of artists assume that copyright is good for their creations without actually doing too much research into the law. They slap a copyright symbol on their art and call it good because any more reflection on the matter would probably lead to some boring blah 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 of the legal variety, and nobody really likes that except lawyers. Still, if you're tired of lending your tacit support to something you don't fully understand, there's a quick and easy way to figure out how you really feel about copyright without doing any research. It's a litmus test for thoughts on IP law, and it comes in the shape of the Eiffel Tower, because Paris's architectural wonder exists in a funny place, copyright-wise. The monument itself is in the public domain. You can photograph the tower and publish your images to your heart's content, but only as long as you're photographing just the monument, because, unlike the structure itself, the tower's decorative lights are copyrighted. You can't publish images of the Eiffel Tower illuminated as it is at night without getting permission first. To me, this illustrates poignantly the way that copyright has run amok. To others, the Society of the Exploitation of the Eiffel Tower, trying to control photos of one of the world's most famous public artworks, makes perfect sense. It's right and good. It's helpful to creatives everywhere that this group be allowed to stop derivative art being made from their work. This, despite the fact that their work is only interesting to anyone because it is itself derivative art. After all, the light design that the Society is so deftly exploiting would not exist without the architectural art that supports it. With all that in mind, this is the test. Do you think that the copyright on the lights might be unethical and is almost certainly impractical? Or do you believe that the Society's behavior represents the rights and dreams of all artists? If you like what the Society is doing, it's safe to say that you're not going to enjoy this book. You've been warned. If, on the other hand, you think the Society's copyright is a bit cheeky or even sneaky, but you still have lots of questions about how to function as an artist without copyright, welcome. This book is for you. Chapter 2. Why you must learn about copyright despite the boring blah blah blah. The hard truth is that no one will floss for you. No one will make sure that you have healthy gums and teeth to last your lifetime. You're the only one who can do that for you. In much the same way, no one will look out for your interests where copyright is concerned. Not sworn arts advocates and certainly not lawyers unless you pay them. The only one who can make sure that you don't get sued for copyright infringement is you. So it seems like a simple enough issue, right? You might be thinking, if no one will look out for me in this regard, I just won't violate copyright. But it's not that simple. You might be violating copyright law regularly and not even know it. A lot of artists don't understand intellectual property law. Partly that has to do with just how ridiculously tangled the law is, but it's also a matter of artists not wanting to deal with the whole copyright thing. Far from being benign, this willful ignorance can have devastating consequences. For example, in the summer of 2014, I created a mural in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. While it took just 15 days to paint the piece, there were 15 months of negotiations and paperwork leading up to the project, and much of those 15 months were tied up in questions of intellectual property. You see, I had proposed to paint a memorial for Kirk Reeves, a street performer from my hometown who just passed away a few years before. After chatting with the owner of the building, which was to feature my mural, I created an initial mock-up for the piece, a portrait of Kirk in one of the suits he'd regularly wore to perform, but not wearing anything on his head. On seeing it, the city's mural committee rejected my proposal. Kirk often wore a Mickey Mouse hat while he played his trumpet and did magic tricks, and the committee felt he would be more recognizable wearing the ears in his memorial, and that Portlanders would enjoy it more that way. I thought it would be more interesting to paint Kirk as a person rather than as a performer, but I understood why the committee wanted him to be easily identified, and so I acquiesced. I agreed to include artistic material, trademarked and copyrighted by Disney, in my mural as long as the city took full legal and financial responsibility for the use. I wasn't expecting this stipulation to cause an issue, seeing as the city was the one that wanted to break the law in the first place, but the city's attorney was having none of it. The city would not take any legal or financial responsibility for the ears, but the city was also adamant that I should include them. In fact, even after the city's attorney had made clear that my hometown government wouldn't be taking on this risk, my contact with the city continued to try to persuade me to put Mickey in the mural by telling me repeatedly that this use of Disney's intellectual property was no big deal. When I still refused to break the law if no one was going to have my back, she gave me the name of an IP lawyer in precisely the same way people give you the name of a therapist when they think you're in need of some emotional perspective. Playing along, even though the pressure that the city was exerting on me was starting to feel a lot like bullying, I called the lawyer. He was generous enough to answer my specific questions, but his refrain was the same. This particular use of the company's artistic material was no big deal. In fact, he recommended that I go for it, while implying that the spectacle of an artist being sued by Disney would be good for the free culture movement. When I told him that being a pawn in a copy wrong case wasn't what I had in mind for my future, he still recommended I use Disney's material, while specifying that he was not officially recommending any course of action to me unless I wanted to pay him. At this point, an artist who did not know as much about IP law as I do, one who was more desperate for opportunities than me, or one who is more intimidated by the government and by lawyers than I am, might have caved. And maybe that artist would be fine. It's very possible that Disney wouldn't notice the Mickey Mouse hat on some mural in some city. Or, then again, maybe the rest of the artist's life would revolve around a legal battle with a company famous for defending its IP aggressively. Either way, that's when it hit me. The people in my city's government and the lawyer they had me talk to had all emphasized how much they care about artists, right? They were working to make my hometown more beautiful by making murals happen. They were art advocates. But that didn't mean that any of them was willing to take my place against the IP Goliath. In fact, they didn't even want to fight with me. And why would they? Copyright and its cousins are complicated, and they can leave you sued to pieces even if you didn't actually do anything wrong. It may be legally no big deal to paint a mural with trademarked and copyrighted material in it, but if the owner of that material, its legions of lawyers, and its deep pockets decided to sue me anyway, I might be legally right, but I'd also be bankrupt. In the end, I incorporated some of the mural's committee requests in my memorial, but where Kirk's hat was concerned, I did what I felt good doing, both artistically and legally. And that's only something I had the courage to do because I knew a thing or two about copyright. Chapter 3: The Copyright Paradigm. The problem with copyright begins in how it is perceived. Many of us think of it as a legal thing, something for lawyers and left-brain people in general to deal with. But copyright law doesn't exist simply as a legal reality. It's also a conceptual reality. The idea of intellectual property has penetrated into the fibers of creativity itself. Think about it. We've all grown up believing that culture can be divided into discrete bits that can be owned. Most of us are convinced that when we create a thing, it is wholly ours, physically as an object and also in a less tangible sense as intellectual property. And when someone uses your art in a way that you don't approve of, don't you feel violated? They cheated. They stole from you. They ripped you off. But what if that thing that you made didn't actually belong to you? What if there was a different way of looking at creativity and culture? Facing the truth. I'm a portraitist. I do other things too, but face making is really my thing. I often say that I've sold my soul to the genre of portraiture. By that, I mean that I have given it so much of myself, and in return, portraiture has imbued me with superpowers. The best thing my genre ever did for me, better even than helping me to make my living with my art from the very beginning of my career, was to remove the intellectual property blinders that I grew up with. The way it did so was simply by showing me that others can feel as much ownership of a work as an artist does. In fact, this twist on portrait ownership is demonstrated in our language. When someone refers to a piece as my portrait, it's usually assumed that it's of them and not by them. For example, I like to say that a particular image painted by artist Becca Bernstein is my portrait because the person it portrays looks exactly like me. But in a very real sense, it's not actually my portrait. While it's true that this painting wouldn't look anything like it does if it weren't for me, it's also true that it wouldn't look anything like it does if it weren't for Becca Bernstein. As the art historian Richard Brilliant wrote in his 1991 book Portraiture, there is a great difficulty in thinking about pictures, even portraits by great artists, as art and not thinking about them primarily as something else the person represented. Early on in my career, a painting I made drove this truth home. The subject was a curator in my city. His activities and ambitions tended to be fodder for art blogs, and, looking to add a little color to their posts, some writers use an image of my painting. At the time I was in a copyright frame of mind, meaning I wanted to be given credit for use of the image. So, when a fellow artist lifted this portrait from my site, published it on his blog for what was then a major newspaper, and failed to mention me, I was confused. I thought that, being an artist himself, the blogger would understand the value of intellectual property, but, through an email conversation, he revealed that he did not consider my work worthy of credit. Though he didn't put it quite this way, I gathered that he felt that this portrait belonged more to the subject than to me. At first, the very idea of this was completely insulting, but as I thought about it, I realized that it's not just my portraits that don't really belong to me, it's all my creative output. I need a world of inspirations and influences to make my art, and just because those inspirations and influences don't always have faces, doesn't mean that they don't exist, and it certainly doesn't mean that they don't have a stake in my work. My art belongs to the art world at least as much as it belongs to me. Pursuing perspective. What I'm really saying, of course, is that art cannot be made in a vacuum. The validity of that statement is something that most people can appreciate, but on closer inspection there's more truth to be squeezed out of this tired old truism. The fact is that art cannot be understood in a vacuum either. To explain further, it's easiest if we go on a journey to planet Sad World, a place where no one has ever made a painting. When we show the Sad Worldians one, they are besides themselves. They aren't even able to see the technique and the skill that went into the making of this particular painting, and the subject matter of the work barely registers either. How could the Sad Worldians see this piece clearly? After all, just the simple act of smearing pigment suspended in medium onto a support to create an image is mind-boggling in a world where that has never existed before. This painting needs a context of other paintings before the Sad Worldians will truly be able to see it. Back on Earth, a subtler form of this same thing happens anytime there's a shift in art. For example, when Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, and the rest of the late 19th century upstart artist crew started to flatten out the perspective in their images, much of the public was repelled. This new way of expressing in 2 dimensions was at least in part inspired by Japanese wood engravings, and it seemed foreign and completely unappealing to many Europeans. Then, quickly enough, a lot of Western artists started embracing the 2-dimensionality of painting, and it became a part of the cultural landscape in Europe. Works that did so were suddenly palatable to the majority of people, and Cézanne became a venerated master whose works were historically fascinating, but nothing that would get the critics riled up anymore. Not much later, it was Cubism that was incomprehensible and maybe even a little offensive. It emphasized the 2-dimensionality of painting in a whole new way, and the process of incorporating a new kind of expression into the general culture happened all over again. Picasso may have been a dangerous rebel who was bringing references to African art into his paintings, but, with the cultural context that lots of other artists from his generation provided, now he's just that guy who once changed art and whose work, like Cézanne's and like that of any important artists, continues to challenge and inspire artists today. All of which is to say that art always springs from its cultural context and then immediately becomes a part of the context for both the creation and the viewing of the next generation of art. Maybe a more telling example of context's role in art's appeal and significance is the Venus of Willendorf. We really have no idea what any of the Stone Age female figurines we've discovered meant to the early humans who made them. We like to guess at their original significance, but those luscious boobs and bellies will not give up their secrets until we manage to learn more about the people who made them. All that said, the Venuses definitely have plenty of purpose today in our current context. For example, while it may please me to think of these figurines as fat-positive feminist fertility emblems, they've also been held up as a kind of commentary on primitive humans and their uncouth nature. It all depends on who's looking at the figurines and what their particular cultural context is. A piece of culture needs context. It wouldn't exist without the context that inspired it, and without that original context, its significance is altered, possibly to the point where the work cannot be fully enjoyed, as with the cases of the painting on Said World and of the Venus of Willendorf. To me, that means that, in a practical sense, it's impossible to tease out one individual's contribution to culture from the rest of culture. What's more, the idea that you can keep an individual's contribution separate enough that it could be copyrighted and exploited as intellectual property belonging to just one person borders on the absurd. Chapter 4: Culture Owners, Every One of Us. Even if you're not ready to give up on the idea that culture can be divided up into pieces and assigned to individuals as their rightful property, hopefully at the very least you're starting to see how it's a problematic way of viewing culture. That was, after all, the whole point of the last chapter. But in reality, that's only half the story. In another sense, the notion that culture belongs to each of us is completely true. The fact is, we all own all of culture. Well, according to copyright law, we don't. But by our actions, it's clear that we think we do. We all behave as though we own culture that we don't legally own, and that's actually an indicator that a cultural expression is successful. We're all nesters. We make our own private nests of culture, customizing our immediate surroundings, both IRL and in virtual space. If we love a certain painting, we might acquire the work itself or a print of it and hang it in our home. If it's a song we adore, we probably have copies of it on all of our devices and, if we're old-fashioned, maybe even a CD or a cassette tape of it. And most of us have become meme curators, filling our Pinterest boards with things that make us happy and posting cat videos on every social network we belong to. Sometimes we see something that someone else did, like a hairstyle or a particular way of wearing clothes, and we're inspired to do our own version of that same thing. We're always reproducing pieces of culture, and at times we imitate with our own twist, altering the culture slightly as we propagate it. Probably the most surprising example of owned culture I've encountered personally was in a graveyard. I was in France, in Erdeven, when I came across a grave for a teenage boy that was decorated with a scene from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince. Set in among the gray polished stone and the Celtic crosses, this rather colorful depiction of a lonely boy on asteroid B612 was at once completely unlikely and entirely appropriate. As I stood there mourning a kid I never knew, I had a realization. The prince is as famous in France as Mickey is throughout the world, but I couldn't imagine Disney's Main Mouse on a grave. Partly that's because the prince has a melancholy about him that's more suited to a graveyard than Mickey's high-pitched jauntiness, but it probably also has something to do with the fact that Disney holds an iron grip on all the culture it produces. After all, in 1989, amateur images of the mouse and his friends were painted out of murals at a number of daycares when the mega company threatened a mega lawsuit, thus cementing Disney's ungenerous reputation. And it's a real shame that we can't own Mickey as we'd like to. It makes him seem separate or other. In fact, I think it makes him more likely to be mocked. Mickey has become a symbol of everything boring in culture, and Disney only has its IP lawyers to blame. Culture is meant to be owned by everyone, not just its originator. And that's not only because every piece of culture is made by building on the culture that came before it, but also because it is a living thing that requires each of us to breathe our creativity into it daily. Chapter 5: Imitation is Good. When I said that we're all nesters, I meant to imply that we are all bird-like. To be more specific, we are parrot-like. Then again, we're also cat-like, copycat-like. What I'm really talking about is the fact that we're all imitators. And we start early. Within an hour of birth, a baby can imitate the expression on another person's face. But that's just the beginning for us. By the time we're adults, copying is so much a part of everything we do that we don't even realize it anymore. We're not the only species for whom some kind of imitation is key. All social and intelligent creatures copy each other. Imitation is a social behavior in that it involves more than one individual, And like all social behaviors, it makes a species more intelligent because it encourages its members to define, develop, and track relationships among each other, which is something that you need a certain amount of intelligence to do. So we're not the only ones who copy each other, but humans do it particularly well. We're always finding ways to mirror each other and get along. The proof of our copying skills is in our language and all our cultural expressions, including technology, religion, and art. The only reason why any of that exists is because we are excellent imitators. The fact is that if each of us wanted to be the originator of language, if each of us wanted to name things ourselves, we would be in big trouble. Until we found common ground, communication would be impossible. Someone must start imitating in order for meaning to be assigned. Someone must start imitating for language to come about. So imitation creates language, just like it creates all cultural expressions, but it also creates that all-important context for the cultural bits, whether they're new gadgets, paintings, or fashion trends. This cultural context does two things. 1, it makes the cultural bit seem normal and therefore useful. 2, it spreads the cultural bits to lots of people, some of whom will reshape the bit into something useful for the next generation. A handy example of this is social media. I don't know a whole lot about its development, but I do remember a thing called MySpace. MySpace was cool at some point, but eventually lost its prominence to Facebook and Twitter. These newer tools were similar to MySpace in that they provided a forum for people to interact online, but they also axed some of MySpace's less popular features and added new ones. They expanded on MySpace's beginnings. Facebook, Twitter, and the like are an evolution, also known as an imitation, with some tweaks. Then again, the beginnings of social media could really be tracked to Craigslist forums, chat rooms, and even the original weblogs. It's hard to define an exact beginning point because each of these online gathering places was just building on the things that came before it, old things that provided a context for the new things when they came along. And in the end, social media and the internet itself only matter because we use them. Similarly, we only use them because they matter to a good number of people. We create the meaning, purpose, and importance of online gathering places together. Just like we create the meaning of painting, singing, dressing in a certain way, and believing certain things. Just like we create the meaning of the words I'm writing. We do it together by imitating each other. To sum up, culture evolves by imperfect imitations over time, and since you're built to imitate and all of culture needs you to imitate, it seems only logical that you might figure out how to be okay with imitation. Chapter 6. Where to Find Originality. With all this talk of copying, you may be having some trouble figuring out how you fit in. After all, everybody knows that you're one of a kind, unique, the original. It's true. We are all unique, each of us in our own ways. And it's a good thing too, because without our eccentricities, culture would be having some difficulties. After all, if culture evolves by imperfect imitations over time, someone has to provide the imperfections. Indeed, all of your funny little quirks are actually the source of originality. With respect to art, you could represent the concept with this formula. Art equals idea plus technique plus person. It's the person part of this equation that makes real art inimitable. After all, art is a conversation between the artist and the viewer, with the art object standing in for the artist in the conversation. For the exchange to work, for the art to be truly engaging for the audience, the artist must be really present in their piece. All the most successful art isn't loved for its idea or its technique, it's loved for the artist, for their stunning individuality and their shining imperfections, for their failure to imitate anyone else exactly. In fact, when you look at a painting where an artist isn't really present, it's like having a conversation with a wall. The wall may be very pretty, but it's still a wall and not a person. That's not only boring, it's also very easy to imitate because ideas and techniques are replicable by definition. That's actually what makes ideas and techniques so interesting to others, the fact that they can be reproduced and others can make them a part of their nests. So if you don't want anyone copying you, your game plan is simple, just be there. And be there some more. And again. Until you don't think you can be any more present, but you find a sliver of you still not quite there and you invite it to the big being there party too. The Unimmaculate Conception. A few years ago, I created a series of paintings of animals. The species I was depicting all had one thing in common. Their behaviors didn't fit with traditional notions of gender and sexuality. Crime Against Nature, as the series was called, was a celebration of diversity, and the collection featured homosexual birds, transgendered fish, and cross-dressing ungulates, among other animals. In all, there were 56 species represented, but one in particular was giving me trouble, the Dyak fruit bat. In this species, the male as well as the female lactate and breastfeed babies. To create my image, I was working from a whole collection of photos of fruit bats found online and at the library, synthesizing this material to make a piece that conveyed exactly what I wanted it to convey. I started with a drawing in marker on paper. I then transferred the drawing to panel and began adding layers of paint over the course of several weeks while working on anywhere between 6 and 20 other paintings at the same time. But as the bat piece progressed, I couldn't help but notice I was having trouble making the composition work. At some point I recognized that it was time to take a different track. So I did what I always do when I'm lacking inspiration. I turned to my fellow artists. Specifically, I began looking through images of the most famous parent and child in Western art, and in my wanderings across the internets, I came across this piece by Jean Fouquet. Now, I should say that before I ever encountered this virgin and child, I knew that I wanted my bat's dad's penis to feature prominently in the work I was making. I wanted to emphasize that it was a male who was doing the childcare, but my plan for the penis came into sharp focus when I saw the breast in Fouquet's painting. When I took a second look at the work and noted the multicolored winged babies, I knew I had unlocked my piece. I began painting again with a light wash over my work. I was trying to fit my image into Fouquet's brilliant colors and shapes, but I quickly abandoned that path in favor of starting the piece over. I created a detailed pencil drawing and then painted out a new panel. Clearly, I imitated Fouquet. And he's neither the first nor the last artist I'll steal from so blatantly. Still, I don't think anyone minds too much, and not just because Jean has been dead these 500 years. I'm undeniably present when a viewer engages with my father and child, and it's really only a pleasant surprise when you discover that Fouquet is present with me. His art adds to my art, and my remix of his art adds to the already prodigious reputation of his art. I've always said that I don't care about my work being famous and living on after I'm dead. I go on and on about how happy I am to have my paintings appreciated here and now, to have my days filled with making art because people are willing to pay me to do so. But that isn't everything. The true measure of success for a work of art is that it will be copied copiously, remixed vigorously, distributed freely, and loved lavishly. That's what Fouquet has accomplished for his work, and that's what I want for mine as well. Chapter 7. Copyright. The Man, the Myth. I introduced the main character of this book at the very beginning by defining him simply, but it's now time to get to know the antagonist a little better. Just where did copyright come from, and what is his function in our society? Back in the days before the printing press, there was no copyright. With scribes reproducing text by writing out each letter of every word one by one, there wasn't really a need. For one thing, in terms of time and labor, it was so expensive to do a run of books that people weren't likely to take on publishing on a whim. For another, and this is really very important, not a lot of people knew how to read. Books were just too hard to come by. The culture of reading didn't exist because there wasn't a context of easily accessible books. Then some German guy reinvented a way to make many copies of a text at what must have seemed like lightning speed, and the Western world changed. People started having more of the written word in their lives, and as reading became more prevalent, so did pamphlets, tracts spreading new ideas, often of a political or philosophical nature. The government and the church were none too pleased about the people having too many ideas, so they instituted copyrights, licensing, and only certain publishers to publish certain texts. This kind of copyright evolved over several hundred years. I won't get into the details of this part of the history since there's plenty enough books that do. Suffice it to say that copyright managed to become what it essentially still is, a monopoly. A copyright, then as now, provides the owner with exclusive rights to the money-making potential of a creative work. When there's no competition allowed, it's a monopoly. But somewhere along the way, copyright lost this whiff of unfair market practices as surely as it buried its history of censorship and government control. It became known as a thing that protected artists, allowed them to make a living, and generally nurtured creativity. In fact, the U.S. Constitution describes copyright's purpose as follows: to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Promoting progress! Doesn't that sound nice? Still, the major issue in early copyright's existence remains an issue today, and it's one that's encapsulated by the phrase limited times. How long are limited times? In the US, the term of copyright started out as 14 years. The originator of a work had 14 years after registration of the copyright to capitalize on the work without competition, and they could apply for an additional 14 years if they were still alive at the end of the first term. All in all, this seems fairly reasonable. I mean, I happen to think it's not necessary, and even that it's detrimental to progress, but 28 years certainly seems like enough time for a creative to fulfill the stated purpose of copyright. But that was then. Today, the term is often 100 plus years. The legal math is actually the life of the originator plus 70 years, but that ends up being 100 plus years for a lot of works. That seems excessive for a system that's meant to help artists make money. After all, how can copyright possibly help creatives who have been dead for a lifetime? Obviously it can't, and the long term given to copyright these days has nothing to do with flesh and blood people and everything to do with corporate people. If you could own a potentially valuable source of income that you maybe didn't have any part in creating, and you were a company that doesn't die on a human timescale, you'd probably want a long term for the ownership. You'd think of it as a way to protect your investment. In fact, you'd probably take all your monies to the government and influence its decision-making process in order to keep extending copyright terms so that you can make more monies. The US government has yet to say no to corporations in this situation. As such, it has invalidated the phrase limited times in any practical sense. In other words, while the fact that a copyright can be owned by people who didn't make the work, as well as the fact that it can be bought and sold, are probably questionable in themselves for most artists, these unfortunate circumstances have also created a situation wherein the U.S. government is essentially negating part of the U.S. Constitution, something which is also pretty questionable. Still, the bad and strange of copyright's history doesn't end there. A landmark moment in copyright's occupation of culture occurred in 1976. Until that year, in order to copyright your work, you had to register it with the U.S. Copyright Office, which is part of the Library of Congress. Unless the forms were filled out and submitted with a filing fee, the originator did not own the copyright. Additionally, until 1989, you had to claim your copyright by marking the work with the copyright symbol as well as with the phrase, "all rights reserved." But this is no longer the case. Since the 1990s, when the U.S. decided to align itself more with European copyright law, all work is copyrighted automatically, without notice, and without the artist even having to make the work available for others to copy. Copyrighted became the default position for all works created after 1976. Which is to say that the villain of this book has managed to get every single artwork baptized into its religion instantaneously upon creation. In a saner world, art would default to not own status instead, just by virtue of the fact that all art is built on the art that came before it. The choice to cut a work of art off from the rest of culture should be just that, a conscious and deliberate choice. Pretty please. At its core, copyright seems perfectly polite. After all, copyright law doesn't completely forbid any activity. It just tells us to say please before doing things. Copyright requires that you obtain permission before you print, distribute, or perform artistic material, use the artistic material in any commercial endeavor, or create a new work based on the artistic material. Asking permission may seem innocuous enough, but there's actually something slightly pathological at work. Something that most of us have witnessed all too often in social media. It happens when one user tells other users something like, "Please feel free to share my website with your followers." What's problematic about this statement is that I already felt free to share their stuff. They were posting about it everywhere like a neurotic squirrel who believes that the best marketing practice is to force feed everyone their nuts. And that means that their feel free doesn't come across so much as go ahead, but as do so now. Artists get this wrong all the time. They're all about plastering the universe with their nuts and with reproductions of their nuts, but that doesn't mean that you're allowed to help them. No, don't be misled. Just because they are making sure their nuts are good and visible doesn't mean they want you touching their nuts. You must get permission before sharing their nuts with your audience. This is not the ideal way to relate to your public. But the consequences of requiring permission go far beyond the inconsistent and slightly demented message of, "Please look at my stuff, but ask me before you truly enjoy it." Permission is also a powerful impediment to creativity. Imagine if we actually did ask permission before we did anything that violated copyright. We'd all be too busy saying please and you're welcome to get anything going. How often are you inspired by another artist's work? Do you ask if it's okay to use their work in that way? I'm guessing you don't, because you don't want the other artist to say no or to ask for money. and that's a sign of a system that's not working. When laws are wrong. And speaking of systems in desperate need of an overhaul, all of the excuses people give for embracing a copyright symbol in the management of their creative output, by far the silliest is that it's the law. Really? And you follow every law without question because laws are always, by definition, right? What about the laws that made people whose skin was a certain color into property without freedom or rights? What about the laws that prohibited women from voting? What about the countless laws that still discriminate against people based on their sexuality? Are these laws all right because they were or are laws? It's important to remember that we all give up a certain freedom to live in a society. Freedoms like walking around naked or keeping all of the money we make, among others. And this means that a society's laws are an always evolving conversation about the push and pull of individual versus civic needs. They are a conversation about the shape of individual freedom within the context of a whole and functioning society. Our laws reflect our morality, and our laws change in response to the other changes that happen, changes in technology, in the number and type of people in a community, changes of all kinds. And when laws can't or don't change, as in the context of religious communities which adhere to rules laid out in ancient texts, for example, we enter into very dangerous territory. In order for a society to prosper, laws must be followed, but they must, in equal measure, be questioned, regularly. When people in a society repeatedly break a law, as they do with copyright law by downloading music and movies off peer-to-peer file-sharing sites, or by posting an artist's image on social media without asking permission first, we need to check in with our senses of right and wrong. We need to ask ourselves if this law still reflects the morality of our society, or if, in light of our new technologies and of our better understanding of how culture evolves, the law is out of date. Why do you make art? At this point, I think it's important for each of us to look into our own art-happy hearts and take a moment to reflect. Why are we making art? Is it for money? If we're being perfectly honest about how the whole art industry works, I'm thinking that most of us would answer this question in the negative. I mean, I've made my living as an artist for over a decade now, but I wouldn't ever say that I was doing it for the money. Yes, I need to sell art or reproductions of my art or get grants in order to survive, but I'm not inspired to make art just so I can make money. If anything, I'm making money so I can make more art. Is it for recognition? I think it's safe to say that most of us love it when people connect our art back to us. It makes us feel good to know that we've been a part of someone else's life, that we have an effect on the world around us. Also, getting credit for our work can help us make more money, which helps us make more art. So credit is definitely part of the art-making equation, but I don't think it's the primary motivation for most of us to make art. We didn't get into this game just because we wanted to be famous. There's something more interesting at work for the majority of us. We make art because it is a profound human experience, a reflection of what it is to be a person. Art is about appreciating what is already there but has been overlooked in our everyday busyness. Art making can provide recreation, relaxation, or therapy for the artist. Artworks share information and perspective, and they can be entertaining. Art can even make the artist or things in general seem sexier, more intense, or more interesting. In other words, art changes things. Sometimes it's a small shift in perception, like helping us to remember to stop and smell the roses, or encouraging us to notice how lovely a person looks when they're concentrating, crossing their legs, standing at an intersection waiting for the walk sign, or basically doing anything at all. Other times, the change that art makes is more serious. Art can transform your mood, your outlook, and even your whole take on an aspect of society that you've previously taken for granted. We make art in order to connect with others and to help others connect with each other. We make art in order to contribute to society, each in our own completely important and fully unique way. And copyright has nothing at all to do with any of that. Chapter 8. Getting Business Done. All of this may be sounding more or less outrageous to you, depending on how attached you are to the copyright paradigm, but if you're still reading, I'm guessing it's because you want to understand how an artist can function without copyright. You may be willing to shift your perspective, but only so long as it actually makes sense for a working artist. Fair enough. Reputation matters. First and foremost, the importance of reputation in today's world cannot be emphasized enough. This is true for artists and true for everybody. Living with a significant other before you're married, getting divorced, enjoying gay love, and choosing not to have children may no longer bring down all the judgment on your head like it used to, but that shouldn't suggest to you that reputation is meaningless. It's just an indication that a lot of us have finally stopped obsessing over other people's sex lives. Remember back in the chapter about imitation when I talked about how social we all are? Well, part of that behavior is that we track all our interactions and exchanges meticulously. It's not something we necessarily do in a conscious way, but the awareness is there. It saves us from continually giving ourselves to people who don't understand generosity themselves and other energy-saving things like that. It also very often stops us from doing bad things. More than any law, it's the effect that an action could have on our reputations if it were discovered, which dictates what we do and will not do. If you're not sure you believe me, I think we should have a chat about all those times you've attempted to quit smoking, drinking, eating massive amounts of refined sugar, or doing something else that's unhealthy but that you enjoy quite a bit. Of course, there are physical factors of addiction at work in these examples, but the fact is that all these naughty but yummy behaviors are a lot easier to change if there are social and reputational reasons to change them. Maybe you and a friend are both trying to quit eating junk food, and you make a pact to check in with each other about your progress. When you're accountable to someone else, especially someone who's depending on you, it's easier to be strong. It's also easier to eat well if your family or your general community likes eating well. Otherwise, you may get a reputation for being no fun when you say no to donuts, and that ding on your fun-loving reputation can be harder to overcome than the sugar cravings. So reputation influences our behavior more than we might like to admit. As this relates to art and to copyright, reputation is more often than not what keeps people from blatantly ripping each other off. People tend to copy only when they think they can get away with it, when, for example, they believe that their community and their target's community will never intersect, something which is becoming less and less likely in today's hyper-connected world. Or maybe the imitator and their community don't care that much about originality, which is true in academic art settings where many learn by copying and where citing one's sources is required. Whatever the case, copycats are choosing whether or not to copy based largely on their values, their community's values, and how they'd be perceived if the copying was discovered, not on whether it's totally legal. When not to go to court. In that sense, copyright law, like a lot of laws, is simply a codification of a social reality. It's a way of making reputation's importance official. But since there are real social consequences to copying, bringing the law into the matter tends to be superfluous. It can also be disastrous in the sense that our legal system is not the fairest. Sure, innocent before proven guilty, trial by peers, and all that, but in reality, our legal system does a better job of protecting people with money than people without. If you don't want to use lawyers or the courts, but you do want to do something about a copycat, you have a couple of options. You could either whine about it to everyone you know, or you could start a conversation with the copycat. In today's world, whining seems to be the most popular route, and I understand why that would be the case. Whining feels good. It makes you popular with other people who like to whine, and it's a whole lot easier than the alternative. Still, I think starting with a conversation is the more effective choice. It's a scary one since you probably have no idea what kind of a person the copycat is and how they might react when their imitation is revealed, but it's also the choice where you get to learn the most. Conversations are always a chance to see things from a different perspective. You can initiate the exchange privately by sending a message to the copycat, or you could start the conversation publicly on your blog, through social media, or even in the press if you can get an art blogger interested in the story. Wherever you do it, the important thing is to focus on the positive. Talk about how cool it is to have your art copied, because it really is, and how interesting it is to see what people choose to copy. It's great feedback about your art. Through this conversation, you're likely to uncover a thing or two about the copycat. For example, you may learn that they are immoral or even slightly unhinged and that there's nothing worthwhile to be gained from chatting with them, but it's at least as likely that they are just the sort of people you should really talk with. They could be 1. Someone who loves your work so much that they can't help but use reproductions of your art everywhere in their lives, aka someone you'd want to engage with. 2. Someone who respects your work so much that they are inspired by it to make their own art, aka someone who could give you some excellent feedback about your work. 3. Someone who doesn't understand how you do and don't want your work to be used, aka someone who's giving you a hint that you should be more explicit about what matters to you in the use of your images, or 4. Someone who doesn't understand what qualifies as a derivative work, aka someone just like you, me, and everybody else, because that is a sticky wicket. Corporate power and social currency. Then again, maybe you're not so worried about some random person copying your art. Maybe your nightmare scenario is the company that comes along and capitalizes on your creativity without sharing the profits with you. If that's the case, there's good news. You've got a secret weapon that's far more powerful than anything the corporation has. You've got social currency. Your social currency could also be called your reputation, which, as I've already said, is a big part of the very social act of making and enjoying art. Whatever you call it, I'm referring to the value that you have within your community based on what you have contributed to your community. I don't doubt that you make your corner of the world a better place, so according to the people around you, I'm certain you have a good deal of social currency. Some people think that companies can have this too, in the form of their brand identity, but the social currency of a legal person is very different from the social currency of a flesh and blood person. After all, your social currency is developed and augmented or diminished only by your own actions, whereas the reputation of a company is affected by corporate policies as well as by the behavior of every single person associated with the enterprise. Those are a lot of factors to control, and in the end, the corporate version of social currency always ends up feeling unfocused and manipulated. Companies will try to make up for their lack of true personhood by putting a single face on their brand. A founder or beloved CEO can be used to give the corporation a human look, but that's a ploy, and on some level we all know it. This kind of person, the legal person, will never actually be just one person. By comparison, real human social currency cannot help but be more powerful, and therein lies the advantage for you. If a company appropriates your work, it can only steal the work itself and not everything else that you and your special you-ness bring to the work. When buying from you instead of buying from the company that ripped you off, people receive the personalized interactions that go with buying from an artist, the one-of-a-kind feeling that comes from purchasing a unique item, the certainty that money spent is helping to support another person's life and passion, the satisfaction of adding to their own social currency by buying from an independent source, and the promise of future work that the artist's singular brain will create. You may be thinking that all that might sound good for established artists, but what if you're just starting out in your career? You might worry that you have no currency if your art is new, but that's just not true. If you're diving into art later in life after working in some other field, you still have a community and the social currency that comes with it. In fact, people will likely be really excited to see you follow your dream, and so the good reputation you have as a bank teller or an IT person will bring with it your first art champions. And even if you're fresh out of school, you've still got a lot going for you, currency-wise. You're probably a part of a number of communities, those associated with your schools or which you access through your family. What's more, older people love to help younger people, especially those pursuing their passions, so you do have currency. And no matter where you are in establishing your career, the factor that will protect you most from a company ripping you off isn't your social currency. It's the company's desire to be perceived as having social currency at all. Our society doesn't like the big bully business stealing from the little guy, even if that little guy is little known. The fact is that companies are painfully aware of their lack of true social currency. They're so self-conscious about their weakness that they hide it behind ad campaigns, a pretend personal presence in social media, and a team of intellectual property lawyers. If only independents were as aware of their strengths as companies are of their weaknesses. Then maybe we'd stop worrying about impractical copyright and start paying attention to what matters, the very real relationships that we as individuals can have with others in our communities. How to make a living as an artist. Be friendly, that's it. Or rather, that's a lot of it. The relationships that we have with others in our communities are at the core of the artist's livelihood. Artists don't just make stuff and sell stuff, or make stuff and sell reproductions of stuff to make a living. Art isn't about manufacturing objects and pushing products in exchange for money. Art is first and foremost about engaging with the people around you, which means that artists make money by following these steps. 1. Make art. 2. Share art with the world. 3. Connect with others through that art. 4. Make money through those connections via the public patronage of a grant, meaning a community supporting an artist with community money. The public patronage of crowdsourced funding, meaning a community supporting an artist with individuals' money. The public or private patronage of some institution or some person commissioning a new artwork, or the private patronage of someone buying an art object or reproduction of a piece. I realize it can be confronting to see copyright's role excised so completely from an artist's livelihood, and it probably brings a million questions. So let's look at this idea again, but not in a step-by-step format this time. Instead, let's look at the typical narrative for an art career that doesn't use copyright. The artist begins their career in obscurity, honing a craft and making work that few people see. They are not making money from their work. Slowly, the artist builds a following, showing more of their work publicly and beginning to make some money, either from selling art or through some other means related to their creative work. One day, the following becomes a genuine fan base. At this point, whenever the artist wants to launch a project, they first turn to their fans and ask for support. The fans fund the project, the artist creates the work, and then they disseminate the work freely without restrictions of use, commercial or otherwise. The fans that supported the project from the beginning still buy special edition versions of the media that's being distributed freely because they love the artist that much. Additionally, more people become fans because the work is so accessible that it reaches many new audiences. The artist continues crowdsourcing the funding for their projects. They probably get less exposure than the artists who are promoted through the middleman of a media corporation. Then again, only a very small percentage of creatives ever get the backing of those corporations, and those who do are often required to sign over the rights to the work to the corporations. That said, they are nurturing their relationship with their audience, building much stronger ties than are possible through a company. The artist works in this way, supported by their community both financially and in other less tangible ways, always certain that their work matters because they're in direct contact with the people who love their art. This has been my experience, and I know I'm not the only one. In fact, most artist narratives follow this one fairly closely, even if they are under the impression that copyright has played a role in their careers. And if you're still not convinced, please don't put this book down just yet. I discuss the special edition versions of media that I refer to in this narrative, and dig into all of it more in my last chapter, the one called Practical Tips. For now, I want to make a point that often goes unstated in conversations about how artists make a living, and it's this one. We may love our art. We may feel really close to it. We might even be convinced that it knows us better than anyone else does. But at the end of the day, our work doesn't care about us. When I sell a piece to a client, I know that regardless of how much I adore that artwork, it will never call home to let me know how it's doing in the world. Instead, it's the clients who keep up the relationships with me. It's the people who matter. We all know this, but copyright makes it easy to forget because copyright makes us feel like we can keep a kind of hold on our art even after we sell the original. In that way, it keeps us focusing on artwork that will never love us as much as we love it, distracting us from the real relationships that we could be having. All of which is to say that, if you're having trouble making a living as an artist, it's probably because you need to focus more on cultivating your relationship with your audience, instead of hiding in your studio and pretending like your art can be your everything. The copyright paradigm will tell you it isn't so. It will feed your desire to avoid the marketing part of your business, and it will make you think that being social isn't that important. And it will be leading you down the wrong path. Copyright doesn't help artists make a living. In fact, it might very well be doing the opposite. When an artist is really keen on emphasizing their control of their work, they're essentially conveying to viewers that they don't trust them, and that's not a good way to connect with people. Loving the work of an artist who is keen on copyright is a bit like being in a relationship with a jealous lover. Your significant other is so busy suspecting you of all kinds of wrongdoing, so busy accusing you of looking a little too long at someone else, so busy making you feel uncomfortable, that you maybe don't realize that they are cheating on you. Because when an artist is all about their copyright, it feels like perhaps they do protest too much. Maybe they're all about stealing from other artists. Maybe that's why they're so worried about being stolen from. And like the jealous lover who suffocates the person who just wants to love them, an artist can drain all the joy out of loving their work by being too into copyright. Chapter 9, A Question of Values. Indeed, this whole jealous lover concept is an interesting one. If you love someone, set them free. If they come back, they're yours. If they don't, they never were. This famous quote that's famously difficult to attribute is really a very pretty metaphor for exactly what we're talking about. Whoever first coined this phrase set it free into the world, and it hasn't ever come back to them. When you think about it, the idea encapsulated in this quote works as well for creative output as it does for relationships. If you can't release your art into the world and have it traced back to you easily, then either you're not present enough in your work or you haven't yet established your reputation as an artist. After all, when we see an artwork that we like but there's no credit line, the magical tool of the internets can usually help us find our way back to the artist if we look hard enough, if the artist's work is distinctive enough, and if they've developed a presence on the web. Of course, not everyone is okay with all those ifs, so copyright remains popular because it pretends to mitigate the traceability issue. It comforts the artist by leading them to think that their art will always point back to them because of the law, but that's not what's going on. Copyright doesn't truly make your art more yours. All it does is make you feel like setting your art free must be the wrong choice. Copyright is often celebrated as protection, both for artists and for their art. But while protecting is a lot like defending, securing, and conserving, it's also close to guarding, confining, and even imprisoning. We may like to think of copyright as something that protects creatives and their work, but it can also end up imprisoning them. Scarcity and abundance. Another way to look at it is to think in terms of scarcity and abundance. A scarcity mindset is best described with the example of precious stones. These products of our Earth's geology are essentially just more rock, but they're treasured because there's not as much of them as there is of the rest of the stuff. In fact, if high-quality Earth-made diamonds suddenly became very available, their price would plummet because their value has less to do with anything intrinsic to these hunks of carbon than with the suppliers who hold back much of their stock to artificially inflate the price. With scarcity, the value of a thing comes from the fact that it's hard to get the thing, and not everyone can afford it. And that's precisely why education does not function well in a scarcity model. In a society where education is not made widely available, no one really ends up benefiting from it. Sure, maybe the upper class, the educated class, relishes being more knowledgeable than the plebes, and the nobility probably enjoys treating the less fortunate like helpless children, but the society as a whole stagnates and eventually disintegrates as the lower class rises up to claim equal rights and equal access. Education isn't really valuable until it's allowed to be abundant. When it's made available to more people, a society as a whole prospers. And education promotes itself. The more people who have access to education, the more they realize that education is a good thing and a thing they want everyone to have. What's more, education only really starts to get interesting and useful the more abundant it is, because that's when a society as a whole can work together to think up new ideas, make discoveries, and make good things happen. When applied to image use, scarcity and abundance play out as follows. The copyright concept of image use is all about scarcity. The idea is that if I control who can use images of my work, I will get more money for use of my work. And the more exclusive I make it, the more I can charge. If my work is everywhere, certain people or companies might not want to pay for use of it because it wouldn't be clear that their use was a special use, so it wouldn't make them feel very special. In the scarcity mindset, I need to keep my work exclusive for it to have value. In an abundant understanding of image use, the more available an image is, the more valuable the artist's oeuvre as a whole becomes. As an artist's work is seen over and over again, shared and reshared, remixed and mashed up, it becomes a part of the fabric of culture, and everybody wants to know what's next from that artist. A good way of seeing how scarcity and abundance in image use function is to go to a gallery that's showing your work. Chances are these days that someone there will be taking a picture of your art. You could clear your throat at them or frown pointedly. You could berate them or bring up copyright to intimidate them. You could try to make them feel bad, and you could probably even stop them. But why would you? When people take photos of art in a gallery, they're doing so for one of a handful of reasons. 1, they are artists themselves and they appreciate the techniques you've used. They are inspired by something you've done and they want to remember to try it themselves. 2, they are art students. They're learning to see and to make, and on this particular day, you happen to be their teacher. 3, they are art lovers and they've enjoyed quite a lot of art in their day. Still, your art is special to them and worth being photographed. 4, they are people touched by the camera craze. The proliferation of phone cameras has created a culture in which many people don't feel something is real unless they document it. The resulting image may not even be the point. It's the experience of pressing the shutter release that's important. These people don't see a thing until their camera shows it to them. 5, they are photographing your work in poor light conditions with subpar equipment because they intend to sell reproductions of the work for a pretty penny. This means that one of two things could be going on. A, they are woefully misinformed and they should be educated about their mistakes. B, they are a figment of copyright law's scarcity mindset and they would stop haunting artists everywhere if only people would think about how images are actually used. So when you meet someone in an art gallery who's happily snapping away, breathe deeply of the abundance of the digital age. The person photographing your work isn't harming it, diluting it, or devaluing it. They are not an enemy. Far from it, they're someone you could start a meaningful conversation with, someone who might reveal something about your work to you, someone who could be a friend. The common sense approach. Since we're talking about values anyway, I think it's a good time to bring up some parental wisdom, advice that was so formative to me that it made me quit the swim team. When I got frustrated with others growing up, my parents always told me that I can only control my own behavior, not the behavior of others. It's true, and it's easy to acknowledge it as true intellectually, but it's more difficult to integrate this notion into your life emotionally. Even today, when people behave in an unexpected manner, I find myself wanting to tell them how they should behave instead. And that's just silly. For the most part, we can't control other people, and we shouldn't want to. And that's something I first remember learning when I was 12. I was a really good swimmer, and I enjoyed the competition quite a bit, but for me it was about excelling and for the sake of doing a thing well. It was about competing with myself. At one particular meet, I remember being in the bullpen. All the other girls and I, in this area of the pool deck, were participating in the next race. I was standing there, tugging at my swim cap and trying to stay warm, when some girls surrounded me. The largest of them got right up in my face and told me, "You're going down." I remember her splotchy face and her breath that smelled of chocolate, but I don't remember how I responded. At best, I walked away bewildered. At worst, I cried. In reality, I probably managed a combination of those two things. After a few such episodes, I quit the competitive sport. Still, I kept swimming on and off for years, and it was fun, though maybe slightly less fun without the clock to beat. In other words, I acknowledged that I couldn't control all the other girls who were swimming in my region, but I could choose to swim in a different way. What I'm trying to say by all this is that copyright is you trying to control the behavior of others. When we say that we have control of an image, that's not really true. After all, an image of your work doesn't go about doing things that you wouldn't want it to do. No, it's people who are doing things with your image that you don't approve of. You could be really upset by this, threaten a lawsuit, and try to convince us that your right as a human being has been violated, but ultimately it's your choice to be so upset. You're trying to tell the girls who are hopped up on sweets and on a culture that applauds dominating others that they're being stupid, and that almost never ends well. Before there's any question, I'd like to add that I'm not saying we should never stop others from doing things. I don't think we should stand for people harming us, other people, or themselves. That said, I'm not certain that someone infringing on your copyright is actually harming you, others, or themselves. Similarly, copyright could be seen as competing with others instead of competing with yourself. And the problem with this way of thinking is that, if no one cares to compete with you, do you cease to do anything? Is the passion in the competition or in what you're accomplishing? Because if it's in the competition, which is where art seems to lie for avid copywriters, then it's a little on the empty side. For my part, I tend to think that if someone else can do what I'm doing but do it better than me, maybe they should be doing it instead of me. Except I also believe that no one ever could do what I do because I am confident in the individuality and the value of my voice. Are you? Chapter 10: Practical Tips. Until now, this book has been mostly about shifting the way we look at things and talking about the mechanisms behind it all. While that is well and good, it's about time we get into the nitty-gritty of it. This chapter is full of alternatives to the usual way of doing business for artists. It explains in detail actionable steps for creatives as well as information that can help them to stay out of trouble. Reacting to work that's similar to yours. Let's start with a common experience for every kind of creative, the moment you discover work that's a bit like yours. Your heart falls to your stomach and your ownership alarms start blaring. The copyright paradigm is telling you to freak out about the possibility that your art was copied, but even if you suspect that it wasn't a case of being ripped off, you're probably still at least a little disappointed that you weren't the only one to come up with whatever it is you came up with. What if, instead of all this upset, only good or forward-moving feelings came with learning about art that's similar to yours? I've had my work copied in every way possible. Reproductions of my images have been used, with and without attribution. My art has been remade by other artists, both in the same medium I used and translated into other mediums, and this has also been done with and without attribution. Portions of my work have been sampled by other artists in their art, though this has only been done without giving me credit that I know of. My style has been copied by other artists, both with and without attribution. I've listed these imitations in approximately the order they first occurred in my career. Every time a new kind of copying happened to me, I had to work through an emotional reaction so that I could come to a new level of understanding of what it means to be an artist. of what it means to acknowledge that art always springs from its cultural context and then immediately becomes a part of the context for both the creation and the viewing of the next generation of art. As of the writing of this book, I have absolutely no problem with most of these kinds of imitations of my work, either with or without attribution. After all, most of these kinds of copying can fairly easily be traced back to the original artist if a viewer wants it badly enough. That said, I'm still struggling a bit with one kind of imitation, the use of my style without credit. A while back, I discovered an artist who was clearly copying my technique. And I say clearly because, even if I could have overlooked the similarities in our portfolios, both the context and the artist's own revelations about how their style evolved proved without a doubt what had happened. When I reacted by publicly celebrating the delights of being copied and showing our work together, the artist not only refused to credit my influence, but also acted like I was eccentric for suggesting that I had played a role in their art. I definitely had some trouble maintaining a healthy response to this ungenerous behavior, despite all the practice I've had sharing my art fully. And when it comes right down to it, I'm not sure I'll ever fully get over it. The fact is that I was raised in a solar system that revolves around copyright. And that means that I'm not certain it will ever be completely painless for me to navigate the free artist's universe. Still, when I am confronted by art that I know is a direct response to what I've created, even though the other artist denies it, I try to check in with myself as honestly as possible. I try to remember that, in the end, it's always more about my own level of confidence than it is about what anyone else is doing. Understanding fair use. Have you ever noticed how copyright seems so right, like a basic human right on par with clean water and not being beaten up by police officers, when it's yours, but when it's someone else's it suddenly seems annoying and frivolous and devised to make things harder? Yes, well, so did the people who wrote copyright law. Even though the concept of copyright only existing for limited times has been rendered meaningless by Congress's inability to say no to corporate lobbies, there exists a limitation on the monopoly of copyright. It's called fair use. According to this restriction, reproductions of copyrighted work may be used for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research, and they may be used without first getting permission from the copyright holder. All of that sounds pretty awesome, and it would be completely fantastic too, if only it were actually enforceable. Unfortunately, on closer inspection, fair use's fairness basically falls apart. To determine whether or not a use is actually a fair use, the factors to be considered include 1. The purpose and the character of the use, including whether such use is of commercial nature or is it for nonprofit educational purposes. 2. The nature of the copyrighted work. 3. The amount and the sustainability of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. 4. The effect of the use upon the potential market or value of the copyrighted work. These factors are quoted directly from Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 107, and the murkiness of it all makes me queasy. I don't think I'm alone in that reaction, and in the end, the only way I start to feel safe again is if I translate it like so. Under most circumstances, I should probably assume that my use will not be considered a fair one unless I have all the monies to pay all the lawyers. Seriously though, every person's comfort level with the fair use limitation is going to vary, and it will vary with every situation. An obvious example of that would be this book. I began it by talking about how I didn't feel secure infringing on Disney's copyright by painting a piece of Mickey Mouse into a mural, but in this text I also published several satirical drawings referencing that same artistic material. That's because when I rely on fair use limitation, I do so only in situations and with uses that feel protected to me. And if I didn't feel protected painting anything Disney into a piece of public art, that's because I was worried that not only Disney could sue me, but also that the city and the building owner could too if Disney went after them. What's more, by its very nature, public art tends to be photographed by a lot of people. As such, if I put part of Mickey on that wall, I'd technically be responsible for a whole lot of derivative Disney works. Finally, if I did end up painting out the mouse's ears later, I would more than likely be out of pocket for those expenses. Totaling all that up, using Disney's stuff in a piece of public art came out to a huge financial risk on my part. Using it in this book feels a whole lot safer to me. With the U.S.'s emphasis on freedom of speech, remixing artistic material for the purpose of making thoughtful criticism is not only okay, but also completely necessary. That said, any way you look at it, the fair use limitation on copyright is hardly robust. If you still want to believe in its potential to restrict copyright's monopoly, I won't hold that against you, but only so long as you don't hold it against me that I want to believe in the goodness and in the power of human relationships to encourage us all to be better people. And regardless of what any of us wants to believe, the fact is that the fair use limitation often fails to reassure people who want to follow to the letter of the law, but still participate in a culture without asking permission from someone every other minute. All of which is to say, can't we please all stop pretending that copyright is working out great for creatives? Creative Commons Explained. The funny thing about the premise of this book, the idea that artists might question copyright actively, is that it's not actually that far-fetched for a lot of artists. Plenty of people already don't believe in copyright even though they think they do. I know this because I can't count the number of times I've heard artists say things like, "I don't mind if people use my work without asking me first. I just want them to give me credit when they do." Or, "I don't mind if other artists are inspired by what I do. I just don't want companies using my work to make a bunch of money without giving me some of the profits." These sorts of statements reveal that an artist doesn't want all of the rights that copyright affords them, which include the rights to control all of it, if, when, and how other people can print, distribute, display, or perform your artistic material, use of your artistic material in any commercial endeavor, or create new work based on or sampled from your artistic material. If you're one of these artists who's only interested in people asking about some uses, there's an easy way to specify which ones you care about. The Creative Commons licenses were developed to help artists tailor copyright to their particular needs. They assume that you want people to print, distribute, display, and possibly perform your artistic material without asking first, but allow you to be more specific with the other two copyright requirements. The licenses are built from the following parts. By. This element uses the word by to indicate that you need to be given credit for your work. ND. The no derivs element indicates that you do not wish to have your work edited, remixed, or mashed up. NC. The non-commercial element indicates that others must ask before using your work commercially. SA. The share-alike element indicates that it's okay for others to remix your work, but they must share the resulting art in the same way with the same license. With these pieces, you can build the license that suits you. If, for example, you don't mind when other artists remix your art to make their own, but you don't want people making a profit off of your work without asking first, your license would be CC BY NC. You could even spread the Creative Commons meme by making it CC BY NC SA. In this case, others can build on your art non-commercially as long as they credit you and license their new work under the same license. The beautiful thing about these licenses is that with them, you're asking for exactly what you want. On the other hand, with the copyright symbol, you're shutting everyone down before you've even had a chance to be properly introduced. The copyright symbol essentially locks up your art in a cage of permissions. In fact, using the symbol is a lot like putting animals in a zoo. Here they are, these fabulous, fascinating, and often very powerful creatures, put away in these constricting habitats where they are seen, and that is all. And the animals I'm talking about aren't even dangerous. Feeding them doesn't provoke them. There's actually no wrong way to feed the art. All they want is to rub up against everybody and get a good scratch behind the ears. And we want that too. We invite them out of their copyright-shaped cages in secret all the time. For my own part, I don't believe in trying to cage art. I place my work directly into the public domain. I do this by talking often about being a free artist and by using the word uncopyright as one of the main navigation options on my website. When you click on it, you're taken to a page that reads, "I place my art in the public domain. I am happy for you to copy, display, and use my work in any way, and you are welcome to create derivatives of my work from my images, words, and videos. I would love it if you gave me credit when you do so. If you're interested in my portrait work, please be aware that the subjects have a say in how their likenesses are used. To contact one of them in order to obtain permission for a project involving a portrait, email me." Instead of using all these words, technically I could use a CCO waiver, where none of the Creative Commons license elements are represented. But I don't tag everything I create with CCO for two reasons. One, my portrait work, which is a large part of my oeuvre, will never be completely free of rights because the subjects of my paintings control how their faces are used. 2, I think the whole premise for Creative Commons licenses is false. Culture cannot be divided up into little bits and owned, so there's no need for me to free my art from ownership. This isn't to say that I don't have a deep respect for the inventors of Creative Commons licenses and an admiration for all the creatives who use them. These licenses do good work and important work. They just don't match up with my vision for culture. Taking a smaller step. If the Creative Commons licenses seem like too big of a step, I understand where you're coming from. They can make an artist feel trapped by how official and forthright they are. There's no wiggle room possible when you state your intentions so clearly. I understand these feelings because, although I began putting my work directly into the public domain in 2009 by telling people they could use my art in any way they wanted, I didn't mention the public domain and my place in it until much later. In other words, the idea of calling myself a free artist scared me more than the act of freeing my art. Eventually, I got used to the feeling of being free, and I was able to transition into a headspace where I could own it fully. The journey from questioning copyright in an abstract sense to questioning it with how you manage the use of your art is a complex one. But while it will be a different journey for every artist, I can think of one simple and relatively painless way for anyone to begin the journey. Start by citing your sources. In the academic world, it's considered normal and even necessary to do so. In fact, it can make reading academic papers tedious, but if you look beyond the irritation of footnotes, there's something really beautiful going on. Although academics have original perspectives, their citations provide a context for their new ideas, and that context makes the conversation about those ideas a lot richer. What's more, it provides direction for other academics as they come up with their own take on a subject. The source crediting aspect of the academic world already finds its way into art a bit, at least retrospectively. I'm referring to the fact that art historians love nothing more than to trace the influences of a given artist. They're all about celebrating the power of context, both in the creation of art and in how it is understood. And many artists eat up art history, reveling in the imitation and the influence along with the historians. Still, those same artists very often refuse to talk about copying and inspiration as it happens in their own work, despite all the good it would do us, and they do so for two reasons. One, the myth of the genius artist who comes out fully formed, created without any outside influence, is powerful. If you admit to being inspired by others, you might be judged harshly, despite the fact that everyone knows art is not made in a vacuum. 2. The legal reality of copyright has real-life consequences. If you cite your sources, who's to say those sources won't try to sue you for infringement? The first reason is an expression of copyright as a paradigm, and the second one, of course, has to do with copyright as a law. That means that, unless you're totally okay with the lie that artists shouldn't need any outside influences to make their art, the first reason should probably be ignored, but the second one is a little trickier. That said, it is possible to cite your sources if you're careful. You can give credit without fear of penalties when the artists who influence you have made it clear that they embrace imitators, or in instances when you're feeling good about the fair use limitation on copyright. However you do it, even if it's just in private among friends you have over to your studio, citing your sources will begin to chip away at the copyright paradigm, both for others and for yourself. When you acknowledge specific influences and discuss them in detail, you also acknowledge the role of imitation in art making in a concrete way. The more you do this, the more comfortable you will become with the idea of Creative Commons and of questioning copyright in the way that you manage the use of your art. And when you examine your image use wishes more closely, you end up building better relationships with your audience, which is, after all, the whole point of art. Artists employ the paywall model in a slightly different manner. They're not showing half of a painting and asking for payment before they show the rest, but they are displaying certain formats of their work to entice their audience and withholding others in order to ask for payment. An obvious case of this is with originals. Oftentimes an artist will exhibit originals at a public venue, somewhere that allows anyone to come look at them for free. If someone wants to enjoy the art in their own home after that day, they have to pay for the privilege. They have to buy the work. The original in a public setting is one format of the art. The original in a private home is another. Similarly, an artist may show reproductions of their art online, making it freely accessible to everyone with a computer and an internet connection, but if you want a reproduction in physical form, as a print, you have to pay the artist. And depending on how much artists give away for free, they might be considered more of a lover or more of a tease. After all, the mechanism of the paywall model is essentially a tease, especially as it works with the news media sites. They get you hooked and then demand your money. But the paywall model can also be used in a more abundant and more loving manner. I'll give an example from my own work. In 2012, I created that series of paintings called Crime Against Nature, the one that features the breastfeeding male fruit bat. The project was a lot more than a collection of paintings, though, and since 2012, I've made Crime Against Nature available for free in a wide variety of formats. It has been seen as the originals in public exhibitions, online images of the work altered digitally to include text describing the animal's behavior, the images and the text together in a book which you can read in its entirety online, and the book version in the form of a free downloadable PDF. I discontinued this offering after 6 months because I had trouble finding a service that would store the book for free and also make it available in a reliable way. In addition to these free versions, there are special edition formats of the project which are only available if you pay. These formats include the originals, prints of the paintings sold via my print shop, prints of the paintings altered digitally to include text describing the animal's behavior available via my print shop, the book version that is for sale as a downloadable PDF, and the hard copy book. From this breakdown, it's clear that I am using the paywall model, but it's important to note that, although the audience must pay for certain formats, all of the images and text that are a part of Crime Against Nature are available for free. Maybe they're not available for free in the format someone would like, but people can enjoy the full project, even the entire 130-page book, without paying me a cent. I do that because I prefer to be a lover rather than a tease. I don't like the notion that, if I show a little something, I can seduce you into giving me your money. I'd rather show it all to you and then ask if you liked it well enough to want to pay me anyway. I should also point out that this way of working doesn't prevent me from doing business with companies who want to license my art. A few years ago, I got an email from an art buyer at an advertising agency. The Gap wanted my art for an ad campaign. Specifically, the company was interested in a piece of American flag mail art that I had posted on my blog. It was featured as one square in a 12-square layout that was a collage of Americana meant to sell the Americanness of the Gap abroad. Since I put all my work into the public domain, the Gap could simply have grabbed the image from my website and run with it. But they didn't do that, probably for 2 reasons. One, even if they took the time to read about how my art has been freed from copyright, they likely wouldn't want to take that piece without permission because they would want to avoid the reputational headache that would occur if I suddenly decided to chastise them for it. In other words, getting a contract signed was simply a risk management tactic. 2, they needed a high-resolution version of the image for their ad campaign, which was to feature large posters. Since I have built my paywall around my high-resolution images, I don't publish them on my site, and that means that the Gap had to talk to me in order to get the version of the image they needed. Another artist might put their wall further out than I do, encompassing more uses with it. They might think it's better to ask people to pay for their art more often because they believe they will end up with a bigger income if they manage to squeeze more money out of more viewers who enjoy their work. I disagree with that logic. I think that generally my audience isn't really paying for my past work so much as they are investing in my career and in what I will do next, though that's probably not the case for an entity like the Gap. Still, none of that means that my more loving kind of paywall is any less of a paywall. The fact is that every single creative uses this model to make a living. The sooner artists recognize this, the better it will be for both their pocketbook and their audience's experience of their art. Though it's impossible to set up an experiment with 2 Gwens, one who runs her business using the lover paywall and one who goes with the tease method, I tend to think I do better by being a lover. Practically speaking, the lover is a kind of novelty in a world where the copyright paradigm still reigns supreme, and that nonconformity helps me to stand out in an ocean of artists. The fact that I'm not only a free artist, but also a vocal advocate of free culture has gotten me plenty of exposure. Lots of press and even speaking gigs at exciting venues, everywhere from DC to Geneva. But beyond these more concrete rewards, being a lover feels better to me. It's more respectful to my audience, and that's crucial to me, just as it's crucial to any artist to understand who their audience is. Knowing your audience. When it comes to engaging with your work in a financial way, there are really just 4 kinds of viewers. 1, people who won't pay. 2, people who donate. 3, people who browse before buying. 4, people who buy. When you look at these groups, your first reaction may be to write off those who don't pay. I mean, who are those feckless losers anyway? Who would be so rude as to refuse to support artists? How about you? And me? And everyone else? We all enjoy a lot of content for free in the form of our public library's holdings, and many of us also know these hidden places on the web where just about every kind of content can be found for free. What's more, a lot of us love browsing through images online, stuff that creatives make available specifically hoping that it will get you interested in their work. We are all, at some time or another, the people who won't pay. As for the other three groups, it's vital to your artist-audience relationship that you recognize them by giving them the space to do their thing. The people who donate, for example, may simply want to help you out, but they could also be people who really don't want more things in their lives. They have a bit of money to give you, but they don't want any physical object in return. Nurture their desire to give. Accept donations. The people who browse before buying are people that I think most of us understand. After all, a lot of us are used to see what we're buying before we decide whether or not to spend our money. If you can't cuddle up to the notion that people shouldn't always have to pay for content, maybe the browsers can still convince you to release a free version of your work. The people who buy are people that artists love, literally. By that I mean someone who's going to buy any version of your work, sight unseen, is probably a friend of yours and someone who's buying more to support you as a person than because of your art. In the end, the most successful artists will embrace all four kinds of viewers, and acknowledging that fact was one of my first steps in freeing my work completely. Once I decided that those who don't pay me money, but who were still interested in engaging with my work were worthwhile, I didn't see how I could logically try to control any use of my art. What if someone uses your art commercially? It's funny, really, that I'm talking about this topic so close to the end of this book because, in the majority of conversations I have about my own copywriting, this question comes up first. That said, I didn't talk about it up front because, if we're all being clear-headed about this, it's easy to see that this isn't something that's actually going to happen to a lot of artists. To get into this question, I'd first like to take a trip back to Sad World, where no one had ever seen a painting until we came along. Remember how mind-boggled the Sad Worldians were? They were so overwhelmed that they couldn't actually process the technique, the skill, or the subject matter of the work we showed them. Well, that very same painting back on Earth is completely understandable, and it can be evaluated for its unique qualities because there's a context for it. But it's also harder for that piece to get noticed. On Sad World, the painting would have become famous just because it was a painting. On Earth, you need to do a lot more than smear some pigment and medium on a piece of cloth in order to get a work noticed, a fact that any artist who's ever tried to make a living with their art knows only too well. In other words, using an image commercially and making a ton of money off of it is not that easy to do, and not something that happens every day. But let's say someone did do that with my work. Assuming I heard about the use, I would try to get to know them. After all, I would have a lot to learn from them. I would definitely want to know how they managed to move so many images of my art. What's more, I would tell everyone about what they'd done. I would use social media to do so, being sure to connect with my audience, but also reach for the copycats viewers as well. I'd praise their business acumen as well as their discerning taste, while also being sure to mention that they weren't sharing profits with me. Not that there's anything wrong with that, since I put my work directly into the public domain. Still, I would want people to know that if they want to see more of this sort of work in the future, they could also buy from me or from someone who shares profits with me. All of which is to say that my procedure for dealing with someone who uses my work commercially and doesn't share any money with me is basically kiss and tell, or try to kiss and tell, because not everyone who's using my work commercially will want to share their secrets with me. But while I can't force them to teach me their ways, I can certainly model good sharing behavior. This will help everyone to feel more comfortable with the notion that open collaboration is possible and fruitful instead of just dangerous. And since most of us were raised thinking that to survive is an inherently competitive endeavor, we need plenty of models of other ways of being before we'll be convinced. The copyright paradigm is part of the worldview, and both copyright and that worldview are just one way of doing things and not necessarily the healthiest one. 6 steps to freeing yourself and your art. If you're ready now to make a start, this is how you go about remaking your art career with sharing and freedom in mind. 1. Recognize that you imitate other artists. You need the context of all the art that came before you, and of all the contemporary art in order to make your work and to have it be enjoyed by others. Acknowledge this fully and rid your brain of the copyright paradigm's influence. 2. React positively to others copying your art. If no one is imitating your artwork yet, make it happen. Sample from a friend's art and have them do the same with yours. Figure out what you like about being imitated and dissect what you don't like while keeping in mind the power of copyright's paradigm. Cite your sources. Start by talking privately about the artists who influenced you, if that's more comfortable, but don't fail to do it. This is an essential step in breaking down the myth of the genius artist whose creativity comes out of a vacuum. 4. Use Creative Commons licenses. Even if you're not ready yet to give up most of the rights which copyright affords you, use the most restrictive of CC licenses. Doing so not only supports this more transparent form of licensing, but also shows that you're fully aware of what all copyright entails, and that you're interested in educating others. 5. Free your work completely. When you get to this place, don't forget to name your art's freedom and telegraph it widely. 6. Enjoy the special status that all this behavior confers on you. People will think you're being something of a rebel, and also that you are surprisingly selfless. And while questioning established paradigms is a definition of what it means to rebel, it's important to remember that if you free your art, you're not actually being selfless. It only appears so to a world that's caught up in the idea that culture can be divided up into pieces and owned. Maybe the 7th and final step in freeing yourself and your art is living in a world where the copyright paradigm has been toppled. In a lot of ways, that world will probably be similar to this one. It will likely still believe that competition is the way to get ahead, though the focus will have shifted from competing to be the most original, whatever that actually means, to being the most recognized, which is what's really underneath all that competition anyway. That said, the world without copyright will still be a better one, if only because the artist process will have been demystified some. No longer will what we do seem quite so magical, and that means we might have half a chance at having our hard work be respected, and in that way, artists might finally manage to get paid properly. Conclusion. Maybe all this seems like something that would only work for an artist who is supremely confident in their abilities and in their art, but the truth is that any artist who puts their work out there at all is supremely confident. If you're able to call yourself an artist, if you believe it when you say it and others do too, then you're not that far from being able to call yourself a free artist. That means that if you're interested in freeing your art, the thing that's standing in your way isn't a lack of courage, it's the power of copyright. Here I'm talking about it as a law and as a paradigm, but also as a comforting prayer. After all, what is every artist's copyright except an urgent invocation that their art will matter to the world, today and maybe even tomorrow? Copyright is a plea for validation as a creative. It's one expression of the universal desire to be loved. When I think of it that way, copyright seems sort of sweet and definitely understandable. But it doesn't make it any less toxic to creativity. We may need and want to be appreciated, but if we want culture to thrive as well, we must figure out how to ask for acknowledgement instead of demanding it, which is what copyright does. When the copyright symbol appears on a work of art, it's as if the artist is saying, I know I've been inspired by all the art around me to make my piece of art, but my artwork is more important than anything else ever made. It's the one piece that shouldn't be used in any way without permission and shouldn't ever be imitated or remixed. But the world can't stop for any one piece of art, let alone for all the works ever copyrighted. The world will take note of what an artist is doing if they are good at communicating about their art, but it won't ever stop, and it's futile to order it to do so. Instead, we must recognize that copyright is a prayer for acknowledgement and find a better way to ask for what we need. This is no easy task. Most of us lack practice in communicating about what we need generally in our lives, and where our art is concerned, we're only more conflicted. We worry that by asking to be valued, we are admitting that external motivators influence our art making. And since many believe that real artists only create for themselves, needing others and being open about having that need can seem like a failure. In the end, when we try to avoid reflecting on our needs, when we fail to communicate about them very specifically, and when we simply slap a copyright symbol on our art, we're not doing ourselves or our art any favors. Instead of trying to stop the world for your artwork, instead of working so hard to make yourself separate, immerse yourself more fully in the exchange and change that is culture. Take from it and contribute to it. Participate. Share good. This has been a reading of You Share Good, written by Gwen Simel, read by Jacqueline Boss.